There's nothing down that road, Mrs. Harlow. Just trees and trouble. That's what the mailman told her. Same thing the gas station clerk said. Same thing the woman at the county office said when Vivian asked about the gravel road that forked off Route 11 and disappeared into the hills like a secret somebody forgot to finish telling. Then why is there a road? Vivian said. The mailman, a young man named Curtis who'd been running this route for 6 years and liked Vivian because she left him lemonade on hot days and didn't complain when the mail was late, shrugged. Been there forever. Nobody uses it. County stopped maintaining it in the 80s. Where does it go? No idea. I've never driven it. You've driven past it every day for 6 years and never wondered? Mrs. Harlow, I deliver mail. I don't explore. Vivian looked at the road. 100 feet from her mailbox, gravel turning to dirt, turning to shadow where the oaks closed overhead. She'd lived in this house for 61 years, since she was 27, since Walter brought her here after the wedding and said, "It's not much, Viv, but the land is good, and the neighbors are far enough away that we can argue in peace." 61 years, and she'd never driven down that road. That changes today, she said. Curtis looked alarmed. Ma'am, with all respect, 88. I know how old I am, Curtis. I've been counting longer than you've been alive. The road's not safe. No one's been down there in... Then it's about time someone went. She walked to her truck, a 1997 Ford Ranger that Walter had bought the year before he died, and that Vivian kept running through sheer willpower, and a mechanic named Phil, who said fixing her truck was the only interesting part of my week. The engine turned over on the second try. Always the second. The truck was as stubborn as she was, which was why they got along. She pulled onto Route 11, turned onto the gravel road, and drove into the trees. Quick favor, if you've ever followed a road that everyone told you to ignore, tap like and subscribe. Because what Vivian Harlow found at the end of that road wasn't just a building. It was a cathedral. And the story locked inside it had been waiting 60 years for someone brave enough, or stubborn enough, to walk through the door. The road was worse than the mailman suggested. Not dangerous. Neglected. Gravel gave way to dirt. Dirt gave way to ruts. Branches scraped the truck's roof. Twice she had to stop and move fallen limbs. Her knees protested every time she climbed out of the cab and every time she climbed back in, and she told them the same thing she'd been telling them for 20 years. We're not done yet. The road climbed. Gently at first, then steeper, winding through hardwood forest, oaks, maples, hickory, the kind of trees that took a century to grow and another century to fall. The light changed as the canopy thickened. Green gold, cathedral light, the kind that came through stained glass. She'd driven maybe 3 miles when the trees opened. Vivian stopped the truck, put it in park, sat there. In front of her, in a clearing on the hillside, surrounded by forest that had spent 60 years trying to reclaim it and failing, stood a cathedral. Not a church, not a chapel. A cathedral. Gothic. Stone. 60 feet high at the peak, with a rose window the size of a car above the entrance, and flying buttresses along the sides that arced through the air like the ribs of some enormous stone animal. 2 towers flanked the front, one intact, one partially collapsed, but both still reaching toward the sky with the stubborn verticality of things built to point at God. The stone was gray. Limestone, probably, quarried from the hills. Moss covered the lower walls. Ivy climbed the towers. The entrance, a pointed arch, 20 feet tall, with a wooden door that had gone gray, but still hung on iron hinges, stood open. Not broken open, just open. The way doors stand open in places where the last person to leave expected to come back. Vivian got out of the truck, stood in the clearing. The wind moved through the trees, and the cathedral caught it. A low, hollow sound, like breathing, like an organ playing one sustained note that had been holding since the last congregation left. She walked to the entrance. The door was massive, oak, iron-studded, carved with a pattern she couldn't quite read through the weathering. She put her hand on it. The wood was cold, solid, the kind of cold that goes deep, not surface cold, but the cold of a thing that has been in shade for decades. She stepped inside. The nave stretched before her, 100 feet long, maybe more. Stone columns rose on either side, supporting pointed arches that met at the ceiling in ribbed vaults. The ceiling itself was extraordinary, even in ruin, even with sections crumbled and light pouring through gaps where stone had fallen. The vaulting was precise, mathematical. The work of someone who understood that a Gothic ceiling was not just structure, but theology. Each rib carried weight and meaning. Each intersection was a statement about what held things together. Pews. Wooden, still standing in rows, covered in dust and leaves and the debris of 60 years of abandonment. Some had collapsed. Most hadn't. The wood was dark. Oak. Old growth. Hand-carved. The end pieces were decorated with faces. Not saints. People. Real faces. Individual. Each one different. Carved with a specificity that meant these were portraits, not symbols. The altar was intact. Stone. Massive. Draped with a cloth that had rotted to threads, but still showed the ghost of embroidery. Gold thread on white linen. A pattern of wheat and grapes. Behind the altar, the apse. A semicircular space with a wall of stone niches, each one designed to hold something. Most were empty. 3 still contained objects. 2 candlesticks, tarnished to black, and a book. The book was large, leather-bound, resting in its niche as if someone had placed it there deliberately, positioned it just so, left it for whoever came next. Vivian reached for it. Her hands shook, not from cold or fear, but from the specific tremor that 88 years of living puts in your fingers. The vibration of a body that has done 10 million things and is still reaching for one more. She opened the book. The pages were thick. Vellum, not paper. The handwriting was precise. Ink, faded but legible. The kind of penmanship that takes decades to develop and centuries to appreciate. The first page read, "The Record of St. Michael's Cathedral, built 1924 to 1931 by the congregation and hands of Elijah Crane, master builder." This book contains the names of every person who laid stone, carved wood, or gave labor to the building of God's house on Miller's Hill. Vivian turned the page. Names. Hundreds of them. Each one written in the same careful hand, followed by a description of the work they'd done. Thomas Avery quarried 340 tons of limestone from the South Ridge. Margaret Solis sewed all altar linens and vestment cloths. Joseph Black Eagle carved the 47 pew portraits from a single white oak felled on his land. Clara Watkins mixed and applied all interior plaster over 14 months. The names went on, page after page. Workers, artisans, farmers, women, men, children who carried water or held tools or swept stone dust. The entire community, every person who touched this building, documented by name, by contribution, by hand. Vivian sat in the front pew. Dust rose around her. The cathedral breathed its one long note. She read the book for an hour, turning pages as carefully as turning sleeping children, and when she reached the last entry, dated September 1931, the day the cathedral was consecrated, she understood two things. First, this cathedral had been built entirely by hand, by a community of fewer than 200 people over 7 years. No outside contractors, no heavy machinery, just stone, wood, human muscle, and the kind of faith that doesn't ask whether something is possible before starting. Second, the last entry in the book was written by Elijah Crane himself, and it explained why the cathedral had been abandoned. The bishop has refused consecration. He says a cathedral requires his authority and his appointment, and neither has been given. He says we are not a parish, not a diocese, not a recognized body of the church. He says our building, our 7 years of labor, our stone and wood and sweat and prayers, is unauthorized. He has ordered us to cease use of the structure immediately. The congregation is devastated. I am devastated. But I will not tear down what we have built. I will close the door. I will leave this book. And I will trust that God's house does not require a bishop's signature to stand. Tap like if you believe that some buildings are too sacred to stay forgotten. Because Vivian Harlow was sitting in a cathedral that a bishop had silenced 60 years ago, and she was about to give it back its voice. Vivian drove home, set the book on her kitchen table, made tea, called the only person she could think of. Phil. Mrs. Harlow, if this is about the truck... It's not about the truck. Do you know anything about a cathedral on Miller's Hill? Silence. Long enough that Vivian checked her phone to make sure the call was still connected. Where did you hear about that? Phil said. His voice was different, careful. I didn't hear about it. I drove up there. I went inside. Phil, it's extraordinary. It's a full Gothic cathedral built by hand in the 1920s, and nobody knows it's there. People know, Mrs. Harlow. They just don't talk about it. Why? Another silence. Then, my grandfather helped build it. He laid stone on the south wall for 3 years. When the bishop shut it down, my grandfather never spoke about it again. None of them did. It was a wound. The whole community had given everything to that building, and an official in a collar said it wasn't legitimate. People were ashamed, not of the work, of being told the work didn't count. That's 60 years of shame, Phil. Yes, ma'am, it is. Do you know who else's family was involved? Mrs. Harlow. In 1931, there were maybe 180 people in this valley. Almost every family within 20 miles contributed something. The Averys quarried the stone. The Solis family did the textiles. Joseph Black Eagle, he was Vivian. My grandmother used to say his carvings were the most beautiful things she'd ever seen. They're still there. The pew carvings, 47 faces. Still there. Phil was quiet again. Then, my grandfather's face is one of them. Vivian looked at the book on her kitchen table, at the names, at the work documented in ink that had waited 60 years to be read. Phil, I need your help. With what? I want to open it. Not as a church. I'm not fighting with bishops. As a heritage site. A monument. Something that honors the people who built it. Mrs. Harlow, you're 88. I'm aware. That means I don't have time to waste on reasons not to do things. Phil showed up the next morning with his truck and his toolbox and a look on his face that was halfway between reluctance and recognition. The look of a man who's been waiting for someone to say the thing he couldn't say himself. They drove up together. Phil hadn't been to the cathedral since he was 12, when his grandfather had taken him once, the only time, walked him through the nave in silence, pointed at a face on the third pew from the front, and said, "That's me. I was 32. I had more hair." Then his grandfather had walked out and never gone back. Phil stood in the nave now, 53 years later. He looked at the vaulting, the columns, the rose window, still intact, its glass a mosaic of blues and reds and golds that caught the afternoon light and threw it across the stone floor in patterns that looked like prayer made visible. He walked to the third pew, found the face, his grandfather at 32, carved in oak by a man named Joseph Black Eagle, who'd understood that a building's truest decoration was the people who built it. Phil put his hand on the carving. Didn't speak. Didn't need to. "What do you need?" he said finally, his voice rough. "Everything. The roof has gaps, the tower is partially collapsed, the floor needs clearing, the door needs rehinging, and I need to find the families." The families in the book. Every name, every descendant. They deserve to know what their grandparents built. Phil looked at the cathedral, at the light through the rose window, at his grandfather's face in the wood. "I'll make some calls," he said. The calls went out like ripples. Phil called his cousin, who called the Avery family, who called the Solis family. Vivian called the County Historical Society, the State Preservation Office, and a professor at the university named Dr. Anita Reyes, who specialized in vernacular architecture, buildings made by communities without professional architects. Dr. Reyes drove out within 48 hours. She spent 6 hours in the cathedral, measuring, photographing, running her hands along the stone. "Mrs. Harlow, this is structurally extraordinary. The rib profiles, the proportions, this isn't amateur work. Crane was working from medieval French Gothic models, but the execution is entirely local. Local stone, local wood, local techniques." He taught himself? He must have studied extensively, and there are maybe 5 or 6 vernacular Gothic structures in the entire United States. Most are chapel-sized. This is full-scale. Nave, transept, apse, flying buttresses, rose window, built by fewer than 200 people with no power tools. And then a bishop closed it because he didn't authorize it. Dr. Reyes looked at Crane's final entry. He closed it because he couldn't control it. A community that builds its own cathedral doesn't need a bishop's permission for anything. That's the real threat. Can we save it? We can register it. State historic site, possibly national. This book with every builder's name? That's unprecedented. How long? 6 months to a year for state. I'm 88. Can we hurry? The families came. Not all at once. In ones and twos, then groups, then a wave. Phil's calls had reached further than he'd expected. The names in the book connected to families scattered across 4 states, people who'd moved away from the valley decades ago, but who carried, in their family stories and their grandparents' silence, the memory of a building they'd been told didn't count. The first was Marcus Avery, 67, grandson of Thomas Avery, who'd quarried 340 tons of limestone. Marcus drove from Chattanooga with his wife and 2 adult children. He stood in the nave and looked at the stone walls his grandfather had pulled from the earth. "He never talked about it," Marcus said. "My father said Grandpa Thomas worked on a building once that got shut down, and he never mentioned it again. Like it hurt too much." "It's still standing," Vivian said. "Every stone he quarried, still standing." Marcus touched the wall, ran his fingers along the mortar joints, still tight after 60 years, because Thomas Avery had mixed his mortar the way medieval masons did, with lime and sand and the patience of a man who understood that what you put between the stones mattered as much as the stones themselves. Maria Solis came from Nashville, 71, granddaughter of Margaret Solis, who'd sewn the altar linens. The linens were gone, rotted to threads, but the embroidery pattern was still visible. Maria photographed it, traced the design on paper, and said, "My grandmother taught me to sew. She never told me where she learned. Now I know." Joseph Black Eagle's great-granddaughter, a woman named Sarah Whitehawk, 44, from the Cherokee Reservation in North Carolina, drove 7 hours when Phil's cousin's call reached her through a chain of relatives she'd lost touch with. She stood in front of the pew carvings for a long time. 47 faces. Her great-grandfather had carved every one from a single white oak that had grown on his land. "He was an artist," she said quietly. "My family always said he could make wood speak. I thought it was a story." "It's not a story," Vivian said. "Look at them. They're speaking." Sarah touched one of the faces, a young woman laughing, her hair carved in waves that seemed to move in the light from the rose window. "Do you know who this is?" Vivian opened the book, found Joseph Black Eagle's entry. Read, "Pew 12, Seat 4. Portrait of my daughter, Alma, age 16. She carried water every day of construction for 3 years. I carved her laughing because that is how she is. Always laughing." Sarah's hand stayed on the carving. Her great-aunt Alma, laughing at 16. Immortalized in oak by a father who wanted to make sure someone remembered that his daughter was more than a water carrier. She was joy. If you've ever found a piece of your family you didn't know was missing, stay with me. Because the families didn't just come to look. They came to rebuild. The restoration began in April. Not with contractors or government grants. Those would come later. It began with the families themselves, returning to the building their grandparents had constructed, picking up tools their grandparents had held, and finishing what a bishop had stopped. Marcus Avery organized the stone repair. His construction company donated equipment and expertise. The collapsed tower section was stabilized, then rebuilt using limestone from the same ridge Thomas Avery had quarried. The deposit was still there, still accessible, still producing the same gray stone. Phil rebuilt the roof. He worked with a timber framer from Asheville who'd seen Dr. Reyes's photographs and volunteered because, "I've been framing roofs for 30 years, and I've never seen vaulting like this. I need to understand how they did it." Maria Solis recreated the altar linens. Same pattern, same technique. She used linen she'd woven herself on a loom her grandmother had taught her to use, and gold thread she'd bought from a supplier in New York who'd given her a discount when she told him the story. Sarah Whitehawk cleaned and preserved the pew carvings. She brought a wood conservator from the Smithsonian, a woman who'd worked on colonial-era furniture and who, upon seeing the 47 faces, said, "These are museum quality. Every one. The technique is, I've never seen anything like it outside of European medieval work. Vivian supervised. From a folding chair in the nave, wrapped in a blanket when the mornings were cold, drinking tea from a thermos Phil's wife had given her, she watched the cathedral come back to life. She was 88. Her knees were gone. Her hands shook. She couldn't lift stone or frame wood or climb scaffolding. But she could hold the book. She could read the names. She could tell the workers, the grandchildren and great-grandchildren of the original builders, exactly who had done what, and where, and why. She was the memory. And memory, it turned out, was the most important tool in the building. The state historical designation came in August, fast, even by Dr. Reyes's standards. The application had been supported by the university, the county, 14 descendant families, and a petition signed by 2,300 people in the surrounding communities. The certificate was presented at the cathedral itself. Vivian stood at the altar, the same altar where Elijah Crane had planned to hold the first service before the bishop's letter arrived, and accepted it from the state preservation officer. "On behalf of the state of Tennessee," the officer said, "I'm honored to designate St. Michael's Cathedral as a state historic site. This building represents one of the most remarkable examples of community-built vernacular Gothic architecture in the United States." Applause. 67 people in the nave, descendants, neighbors, workers, Dr. Reyes and her students, Curtis the mailman who'd told Vivian there was nothing down that road and had spent the last 4 months helping clear brush from the grounds because he felt guilty about being wrong. Vivian held the certificate, looked at the cathedral around her, the repaired vaulting, the new roof letting light through the rose window in patterns that hadn't existed in 60 years. The pew carvings, cleaned and oiled, 47 faces looking out at a congregation that had finally returned. "This building was shut down in 1931, Vivian said, her voice carrying through the nave with the clarity of a woman who'd been speaking her mind for 88 years and wasn't about to stop. "A bishop said it didn't count. He said it wasn't authorized. He said these people, farmers, miners, mothers, carvers, a man who quarried 340 tons of stone with his hands, didn't have permission to build a house of God." She paused, looked at the faces in the pews, not the carved ones, the living ones. He was wrong. You don't need permission to build something sacred. You need hands. You need stone. You need 7 years and 180 people who believe that what they're building matters more than what anyone says about it. She held up the book, the original, Elijah Crane's record. Every name in this book belongs to someone who gave their labor to this cathedral without being asked, without being paid, without being authorized. They built it because they believed in it. And when it was taken from them, they went silent. Not because they were ashamed, but because the wound was too deep to speak about. She looked at Marcus Avery, at Maria Solis, at Sarah Whitehawk, at Phil, standing in the back, arms crossed, eyes wet. We're speaking now, 60 years late, but we're speaking. And this building, their building, is standing, the way Elijah Crane said it would. She opened the book to the last page, Crane's final entry, read it aloud. "I will close the door. I will leave this book. And I will trust that God's house does not require a bishop's signature to stand." The cathedral was silent. Then Sarah Whitehawk started clapping. Then Marcus. Then everyone. The sound filled the nave, rose through the vaulting, bounced off stone that had been laid by hand 90 years ago, and reached the rose window, where it scattered into light and color and the particular resonance that only exists in spaces built for the purpose of holding human voices together. The national designation process began the following month. Dr. Reyes predicted 2 to 3 years. Vivian told her she had 1. Mrs. Harlow, the National Register doesn't work on your timeline. Then they should start. I'm 88. I've already found the cathedral, organized the restoration, located the families, and gotten state designation. The federal government can at least match my pace. Dr. Reyes laughed, then made some calls. The cathedral opened to the public in October. 1 year after Vivian had driven down a road the mailman told her led to nothing. Guided tours on weekends. Vivian led everyone. In a folding chair with wheels that Phil had rigged up so she could move through the nave without standing. She told the story, the names, the stone, the carvings, the bishop's letter, the 60 years of silence, the book she'd found in the niche behind the altar, waiting, as Elijah Crane had intended, for whoever came next. Visitors came, from the county, the state, eventually from across the country. Architecture students, history researchers, families who found their names in the book and stood in a building their relatives had created with nothing but faith and muscle and time. One visitor, an elderly man, 91, who'd driven from Memphis with his daughter, stood in front of the rose window and wept openly. "My mother made this glass," he said. "She never told me where it went. She just said she'd made something beautiful once, and someone told her it didn't matter." "It mattered," Vivian said. "It's been here the whole time." He looked at the window, blue and red and gold, catching the morning sun the way it had caught it every morning for 90 years, whether anyone was there to see it or not. "She would have wanted to know," he said. "She knows now." On a Tuesday in November, Vivian drove her truck to the cathedral for the last time as the primary guide. Not because she was quitting, because Phil had organized a rotation of family descendants who would take over the tours, each one telling their own family's piece of the story. The cathedral didn't need one voice anymore. It needed all of them. She sat in the nave, the folding chair, the blanket, the tea, the book on her lap. Curtis the mailman found her there. He'd been delivering mail to the cathedral now, actual mail. Letters from visitors, requests for tours, a note from the Smithsonian about a potential exhibition of Joseph Black Eagle's carvings. "Mrs. Harlow, mail call." "Thank you, Curtis." He lingered. "Can I ask you something?" "You've been asking me things for 6 years. Why stop now?" "Why did you drive down that road? That day? After 61 years of living right there. Why that day?" Vivian looked at the cathedral, the light, the stone, the faces in the wood. "Because I was 88, she said. And I realized I'd spent 61 years looking at a road and never once asking where it went. And I thought, if not now, when? If not me, who? I'll be dead in a year or 5 or 10, and that road would still be there, and nobody would drive down it. And this building would keep standing in the dark with nobody to see it. She touched the book. Some things wait. This cathedral waited 60 years. But waiting only works if someone eventually comes. I decided to be the someone. Curtis nodded, looked at the rose window. The light moved across the floor in colors that had no name, but that everyone recognized as beautiful. "I'm glad you didn't listen to me," he said. Curtis, I'm 88 years old. I stopped listening to people who tell me there's nothing down the road a long time ago. He laughed, left the mail, drove his route. Vivian sat in the cathedral until the light faded. The rose window went from gold to amber to gray. The faces in the pews watched her the way they'd watched everything, with the permanent, patient attention of things carved to last. She opened the book one final time, turned past the last entry, Elijah Crane's, 1931. Found the blank page that followed. The first blank page in 60 years. She picked up a pen, the same pen she'd used to write checks and grocery lists and birthday cards for decades. Ordinary, blue ink. She wrote, Vivian Harlow, October 2025. I found this cathedral by driving down a road I was told led to nothing. It led to everything. The building was here. The book was here. The names were here. All that was missing was someone who would open the door. I opened it. The families came back. The stone was repaired. The faces in the wood were seen again. Elijah Crane was right. God's house does not require a bishop's signature to stand. It requires hands and stone, and people who believe that what they build matters. I believe it matters. I am 88 years old, and this is the most important thing I have ever done. She closed the book, set it back in its niche behind the altar, exactly where she'd found it. Then she walked to the door, slowly, her knees arguing with every step, and stood in the entrance, looking out at the clearing and the trees and the road that wound down through the forest to Route 11, and the mailbox where Curtis left the mail, and the house where Walter had carried her through the front door 61 years ago. Behind her, the cathedral stood. Stone and glass and wood and the names of 180 people who'd built something extraordinary and been told it didn't count. It counted. It had always counted. And now, the world knew.